Danse, hello, and welcome to the Matriarch Movement podcast. I'm your host, Shayla Ouellette Stonechild, and I'm super excited to have publisher and filmmaker Rebeka Tabobondung. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of MUSKRAT Magazine, which is a leading online Indigenous arts and cultural magazine. She's also a writer, a poet, and an Indigenous knowledge researcher. Spirit of Birth, her latest film project, is an 8-part series she directs and hosts following Indigenous midwives and families as they restore birthing practices across Turtle Island. I'm super excited to dive into her journey, get to know the series a little bit more, and talk about the importance of reclaiming Indigenous knowledge and birthing systems. Thank you so much, Rebeka, for being here. If you just want to introduce yourself to the audience and where you're from. Hi.
Miigwech, thank you for the invitation. So, Rebeka Tabobondung Indigenous, Wasaksing Don Jaba, Amik Dodam, Ozawa Benisi. So, my name's Rebeka Tabobondung. I'm from Wasaksing First Nation, and we're an Anishinaabe community on Lake Huron. And we're about 3 hours drive north of Toronto. And I'm Beaver Clan. And my spirit name is Golden Thunderbird.
I love that. Golden Thunderbird. And I love everything that you're up to recently, but I'm really interested to know a little bit more of your background and what led you to storytelling through film, through publishing, through writing. Is that something you always thought was going to be a part of your life path?
I grew up in over 13 towns and cities across Canada. And so my dad is from Wasaksing First Nation, and my mom actually was born in Holland. And so as a child, I spent time here in Wasaksing, but we also moved around a lot. So back in the 70s, a lot of the families here in Wasaksing were traveling for work and were moving out west. So I also grew up in Alberta, in Fort McMurray, in Calgary, in Edmonton, and then we moved to Vancouver Island, and I lived in Vancouver. So I grew up not so connected to my community and within the public mainstream education systems, which at that time there was no Indigenous content whatsoever in the public school systems. And, unfortunately, in all these little towns, and it still obviously happens today, there's a lot of, racism and stereotypes about Indigenous people. So I grew up very much wanting to learn about my culture and not having that access. And my mom and my father divorced when I was 3 years old. And so, my mom didn't have that connection. So I just had an opportunity as a young adult to attend a program that invited Indigenous youth from BC, because at the time I was living in BC, to Guatemala with Mayan youth. And I had a chance to travel with a Mayan Indigenous human rights organization and learn about their history. And I was so shocked that they had basically just survived like a genocide that very recently, like there had been massacres up until 1996 when the peace accords had been signed. So as I traveled with them, they actually handed me a camera, and it was my first video camera that I remember holding. And we traveled to communities, and they invited people to share their stories. And I saw, the lineups of hundreds of Indigenous people that were coming to document their stories. And it was so very emotional. And I could just see the power, like they had never had a chance to document their stories. And I never even knew about these massacres happening. It taught me that, wow, the power of media and education, like there is no representation in the main media. And that, of course, was before the internet and all of this. So that really made me understand. And then we were hosted by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So we got to travel with their leadership for 3 months, touring Vancouver Island. And it, was also such an eye-opening, life-changing experience for me because I had only, got to hear about Indigenous history at that time through the mainstream public school system.
Mm,
Just saw how important it was to tell our stories and have space. At that time, people weren't even saying the word colonization or
mm,
colonialism or even residential school. My interests were in learning about our culture and talking to elders and then documenting that and sharing that and inspiring people. Of course, becoming a mom, I've, been even more inspired to learn and share.
yeah. No, I could totally resonate with that. There's something that happens when one, you share your story, but then you're being observed by others and others are witnessing you share your own story. I feel like that there's a healing that happens on a subliminal level within those moments. And I love that you bring up how becoming a mother also changed the trajectory of your own life. I'm curious how your own birth experience transformed the direction of your life and your work.
So by this time, when I became pregnant, I had moved to Ontario to be closer to family and relatives here, and was attending U of T. And when I was pregnant, I was, so excited and just knew very deeply like this is obviously a life transforming
Yeah.
event and stage. Like this is like as such, going to change my life forever. And I was, doing research, like what's out there. Like I want to learn from an Indigenous perspective, about
Mm,
this stage of life that I'm going into, and like what kinds of teachings do we have in our community. And so what I found at the time there, it was very little. Again, this was my son's now 20, almost 20. And I was living in Toronto, and at that time there were Indigenous midwives who were just
mm,
about to form their own Indigenous practice, midwifery practice. They hadn't yet formed it. And so I asked them, could you share some of your knowledge with me about, traditional birth knowledge or anything that you know? And then at that time they said, well, Rebecca, we feel we're on the same journey as you. We're just
mm,
learning ourselves. We've
mm,
been trained in this Western system, but we're on that journey and we're working with elders and learning this knowledge too. That's when I decided to focus my research on Indigenous birth knowledge. And I was doing my master's at the Ontario Institute of Education, and I was doing my thesis. And so I decided right then and there, okay, I'm going to focus on Indigenous birth knowledge from Wissahickon and talk to the grandmothers and mothers in my community. And I'm going to interview them and create a, a little documentary and just see, and I was here in Wissahickon spending time on the land. My dad and I were building a cabin, and my dad said, did you know your great grandmother, Lucy, was a midwife? And so that was
mm.
another thing that just inspired me. I was like, no way.
That's so
And
cool.
yeah, it was so cool. So it was just like being pregnant here on the land. And the other thing was my sister was studying midwifery as well. And so it just like all these doors were like midwifery and what does that mean? And I was learning about it and learning about birth. And I realized, wow, it is different, like to have a midwife or different forms of healthcare that people have access to. And one of the things with midwifery, and this is not just Indigenous midwifery, but is it's all about informed consent and decision making. So you get more time with the midwife as opposed to a mainstream, doctor's appointment, and they present all of these different options you have as a pregnant person. Like, where would you like to give birth? You could give birth in
Mm,
a hospital. You could also have a home birth. And that's the thing that midwives are highly trained in is birth. And so, I was like, oh my gosh, like home birth could be dangerous and, like all these fears. And my sister, and just through learning the research, it's actually very safe, and there's very positive health outcomes with home birth. And at that time, of course, in Toronto, you're close to so many hospitals, so if
Mhm.
anything, I remember my thinking, if anything were to, kind of go wrong, I
Mhm.
still have access to, all these hospitals. But the big thing was like just believing in my body, like
Mm.
realizing, wow, like birth is a natural process,
Mhm.
like it's my body was made, to give birth. And then I started just to read like all these amazing birth stories. It was kind of a leap of faith, like to trust in my body, and then I decided to rent a birth pool, and I've always been comforted by water. And so I decided to have a home birth. And I loved my midwives, and they were, Indigenous midwives. I felt very safe and
Mm.
just very respected, and they believed in me. And so I just decided to go with it. So that's kind of how I started on this path, was just being inspired by our own knowledge and just by myself, I guess. That's
Yeah. Oh, you were literally going through it yourself, but it also sounds like it was generational, like you spoke of having midwives already in your family. And so it's almost like you're kind of like interconnecting the dots that you'd even know existed until you were pregnant yourself. And for listeners that have no idea what a midwife is, could you explain what a midwife is in like very accessible terms?
Yeah, I will try. Like, so midwives are highly trained health professionals that are trained in birth and maternal health. So they go through 4 years of training. And in Canada, there are various kind of services that midwives provide. So in Ontario, as a registered midwife, they have hospital privileges. So they and are trained to deliver, provide services like, as I was saying, home care, but also in the hospitals. And
Right.
um, even in Ontario, there's different designations. So, for example, there's also traditional midwives, and that's
Mhm.
something where Indigenous midwives, particularly the Mohawk, Six Nations, or Haudenosaunee midwives, have established their own designation and training programs that are very much based on their traditional knowledge. Yeah, and then in some provinces, like, they're just getting going, like
Right.
in the Maritimes, like, they're just starting to establish midwifery, and let alone Indigenous midwifery. And I
Right.
don't know what it's like in BC right now, like, but I know that there are Indigenous midwives working to grow midwifery there.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, everybody's kind of different. And that's one thing I realized as a filmmaker making Spirit of Birth. I had the chance to visit all of these different midwives and movements happening across Turtle Island, where midwives are working with community, restoring birth, but
Mhm.
everybody's on all different kind of levels and different approaches. But the purpose that they share is to empower communities and heal,
Yeah.
through birth, because it is such a powerful right that we have, as people and as Indigenous people.
That was gonna be my next question before we get into your docu-series. What would you say is the difference between traditional birthing systems versus, like, the mainstream?
From what I see, the difference from a traditional birthing is that, it comes from our traditional knowledge.
Mhm.
So, when we're talking about our Indigenous nations, it's who we are as Indigenous people. So it includes our values, and our cultural grounding. So, like in my nation, in the territories here, it's very much, you know, um, teachings from the land here.
Nice.
So we're right on our, our water, is Lake Huron, Manitou Gami, which is Spirit Lake. And, we have all of our medicines here and our ceremonies and our language. And so for us, our traditional birth practices, include those elements of ceremony and medicines. So, for example, like when I was interviewing the elders here in my community, there's so many beautiful teachings, the welcome ceremony. And so, like when the baby comes, their first bath is with, cedar water. And there's
Mm,
so much medicine, of course, with the cedar water. Not long after the birth, the community is invited to celebrate and welcome this baby.
mhm,
And they invite, the elders to come and they pass the baby along. And the elders get a chance to hold the baby. And then there's a belief, that our elders and babies, they're both close to the spirit world.
mhm,
So they have a special connection. And the elders, they can talk to the baby and they can ask, what are you going to do? Like,
mhm,
what are you bringing here? And because the babies, there's the belief that, our baby's spirit, sits with creator before it comes, and they kind of hash out, together, like what they're going to do,
mm,
what's their purpose and gifts. And so the elders, they see that the babies, they would come into the world full of knowledge. And there's kind of this window of time where they wanted to communicate with the babies, like, get some, I guess, insight, into what they're going to do and all of that and be able to support that as much as possible. And then so there's a huge celebration. Yeah, so that's what I mean by traditional knowledge is, in your territory or depending where you're from, can change and shift. And so, like another example would be the placenta. They don't see those traditions as they don't know about them,
mhm,
or have often not seen them as important. So when a mother wants to keep her placenta, they could just be like looking at them like, what? Like
mhm,
that's no, we don't do that. People want to include their medicines with the birth, their drums, and ceremonies. Yeah, so that to me is kind of the difference, I guess, between mainstream midwifery and then indigenous midwifery, being inclusive,
mhm,
asking the mother, what do you want to include?
mhm,
When I spoke with one of the Cree indigenous midwives who's like 90 years old, and I asked her, like, what's the most important thing, for um, taking care of pregnant women and birth? And her answer was, it's to respect the mother.
mm,
The mother decides who she wants at her birth. Whatever she wants, that's to be respected. And
mm,
another teaching I learned, there's the belief that, the baby feels everything that the mother feels,
mhm,
so of course we take care of our bodies, like our health and our nutrition, but we also have to take care of our spirits, and our
totally.
frame of mind. And so that's why, we respect the mother. The mother shouldn't be afraid,
Mhm,
or worried about where her next meal is coming from, or that she's not being listened to, or she doesn't have control. Like those are
mhm,
things that are really important. And yeah, so when a mom gets to decide and control her birth experience, like that's just the most empowering thing and healing thing. And it
mhm,
was one of the things that they colonization went right for, was to separate, mother and child, and to take away the midwives, and to, take away the children and their power. And so
mhm,
in that way too, it's very healing when, you get to have a good birth experience and you decide what you want.
Yeah, no, I think it's really powerful that we are now in a time where we're reclaiming that knowledge system. And I love that you define Indigenous birthing systems as really anchored in which nation you're coming from and which elements are around you and which medicines your nation uses. So it's not like we're a monolith and all doing the same birthing practices. It's really up to the nation and the community to decide. And I love also how you talk about how it's a returning to the woman's power. And I feel like that is what we're seeing within our nations right now is so many matriarchs throughout Turtle Island really reclaiming their roles and responsibilities. And I love that this sounds like the spirit of birth was really one of your responsibilities. I'm curious how this docu-series came to life. First, like where the title came from, and also it sounds like this is kind of um, an example of almost like your life's work too.
Hmm. Yeah, that's what I realized. Like, it is kind of a life's work, because it just kind of didn't end. And once you start to learn, when I was pregnant about those teachings, and then, of course, then Ziguan, my son, came into the world, and you realize as a mom, you want to pass that on, those teachings on to your child, and for me, like, because I didn't have them, I was very passionate. I want him to have access,
To it.
to these teachings. And yeah, so that's the thing I saw that was missing, from the mainstream at the time was there's no acknowledgement of this, of the spirit of the
Mhm.
transformation that we go through as life givers, as mothers. Like, we literally enter another stage of life. And because of that, like, something also has to die in a way,
Yeah.
like,
Mhm.
there's not that understanding of how special and connected to spirit the experience of birth is. So that's kind of like the title, is I wanted
The
to
title
try
of it.
to articulate and learn, like, what is the spirit of birth, to share that, because again, there's such beautiful teachings, and I believe
Mhm.
they are our birthright, as no matter where we live, to know, our spiritual identity. Yeah, so that's how kind of like the name came about. And then, of course, as you learn more, you kind of learn, your responsibilities as a parent. You learn, like, there's all these beautiful rites of passage and milestone celebrations that you get to have for your child. And so it could be things like, when the umbilical cord falls out,
Mm.
you want to bury that, or same with the placenta. And then there's the walking out ceremony when that
Yeah.
there's baby, is able to walk. And then, there's the naming ceremony, so it just goes on and on. And
That's so cool to witness. Could you tell listeners what the Spirit of Birth is? I know it's a docu-series. There's 8 episodes that are 30 minutes long. It's on APTN Lumi.
yeah, exactly. So it's an 8-part series, and we follow Indigenous midwives and knowledge keepers and families as they restore birth in their communities.
So how did you go about choosing the communities? Was it just because they were close together?
Because I'm based here in Ontario, the nations were more, surrounding this area that I worked with, but still quite broad. So we went to Six Nations and their birthing center there. And then also Seventh Generation Midwives, which is in Toronto. And then I work with a company called Resolution Pictures. They're based in Montreal, and the co-owner of the company, Ernie Webb, he's Cree from
Mm.
Chisasibi, which is James Bay, Quebec. And when I was pitching the story to them, and they were like, "Oh, you got to come to Chisasibi. There's so much happening in Chisasibi." So that's one of the communities. And then the other one is Nipissing, which is an Anishinaabe community in Ontario. And then, of course, my own community was Oxing. So, for example, Carol Cucci is a knowledge keeper based in Nipissing. And so her and her daughter established a midwifery practice there. And then another one is Gudgy Cook, and she's a Haudenosaunee, just amazing knowledge keeper and midwife, and has, of course, very strong connections in Six Nations. Then word of mouth, you start
Mhm.
talking and
True.
going in those communities, and people are like, oh, inviting you to their communities. And so that happened with the other community is Kahiwan, Alberta, which is north of Edmonton. They had started their inaugural birth camp, and then we even got invitations, of course, to British Columbia and even like the far north. But of course, it's like there's budget constraints. So season two,
Yeah. Yeah. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
and other like internationally, there's so much happening in other countries, this movement, like that's what I realized. This is a movement
Yeah.
and it's unstoppable. And we're inspiring each other everywhere and sharing
Mhm.
resources. There's so many stories to document and to tell and share.
That's amazing. I didn't know that that many resources existed for Indigenous communities out there in terms of, yeah, making midwifery, Indigenous midwifery more accessible. I'm curious, what were some of the highlights while you were filming and going to these different communities? I'm sure you witnessed such beautiful, grounding and honestly revolutionary moments. What were the highlights for you while filming Spirit of Birth?
Yeah, I think the main highlight for me is just how much people are willing to share, the generosity of the people themselves, because birth is such a intimate
Mhm.
experience and it's such a vulnerable, experience. So when families are sharing, their birth stories, you know,
Mhm.
they need to feel safe, they need
Mhm.
to feel like they trust. And so in Chisasibe, I visited there probably 5 or 6 times, and I really got to know the aspiring midwives and then reach out to the families. And so we got to, film a birth and be
Mhm.
invited into their mitchwap, which is their teepee. That to me was like a highlight, and it was
Mm.
very hard to film there because nobody knows when a baby's going to be born. You can't have the crew right there, right?
True.
For so a local community member and filmmaker was basically on call, and she went and she filmed. And labor is just so unpredictable, but she
Mhm.
captured this birth, and she did in such a beautiful, it's so beautiful. Just the places I got to go, the beautiful ceremonies I got to be part of, and that they allowed our cameras. And in some instances, we weren't allowed, cameras too. And, we worked creatively to um, show different ceremonies that had taken place. Like it could be like sacred pipe ceremony or certain
Mhm.
songs that were not are not suitable to be shared. And yeah, so in the end, like I feel proud that we held those spaces, I think, with honor, and
Mhm.
respect.
I love that you bring that up too, because that was gonna be one of my next questions is how did you figure out what to keep sacred and then what to show? Because I feel like not only is birth super sacred, but then you have our traditional protocols and you have
Yeah.
these ceremonies that are often not being a yeah, you can't film. So how did you know what to show and what to keep sacred?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like for me, it was always talking, to the people that were sharing the knowledge, and letting them know too, like that if they shared too much or changed their mind, they
Mm.
can at any time decide to stop, or things could be edited out, you know?
Mhm.
And I even, as a filmmaker, for me, like, I think it's important that traditional knowledge, that the elders get an opportunity, if they want, like, to know what is going to be included,
Right.
So I always ask them, like, I'll share transcript or
Nice.
show like a rough cut. The crew is not always all Indigenous.
Right.
So for editing, it's just also following my gut, and my heart too. Like, as a woman, how would I like to be
Mhm.
shown on camera?
No, I totally get it. Sounds like you made the process very relational and also allowed the stories to have a lot more autonomy on how they're being told. What are you hoping viewers get from watching this series, or what do you hope they learn from it?
Oh, I hope that they learn that, you know, Indigenous birth knowledge, is it's a thing. It's a philosophy. It's a way of seeing the world. It's the land. It's also, what our ancestors and grandmothers fought to keep sacred, to keep for us. And you're kind of pulling from that knowledge that is so ancient and
Mhm.
so wise, and that has so much to empower us with. And they can learn like a lot of straight up traditional knowledge, and even watch, these beautiful ceremonies, and be empowered if they want to do them themselves, to reclaim that for themselves in their own families and communities. And healthcare providers, can learn a bit more about who we are, like when we go into hospital settings and have healthcare, like they might, benefit from understanding, um, why certain things are important to us, just to share a diversity of experiences of birth, and
Mhm.
um, reclaiming these knowledge. So that's what I hope, yeah, viewers will get out of it, is to be inspired.
It sounds like the resurgence of midwifery, of indigenous birthing systems is going to and is already contributing to the health and the healing and the well-being of our people. For indigenous women and girls that are maybe on their own path to giving their first birth, do you have any advice of like where they should start? I know you listed some resources that are out there, but I'm curious. Like for me, I'm not even a mom yet. So for me, and if I wanted to give a traditional birth, where would I start? Would I go to my community, ask questions?
Yeah, I feel like, nowadays it's so wonderful to be able to go to the National Council of Indigenous Midwives. They have a website, and, there's all across the countries. You can see like where midwifery services are offered. And then totally, I would encourage all people, whether you're women or even the dads, like go and ask within your own family, what
Mhm,
was your birth story? Like to your mom, or, what was that like? Or was there any cultural knowledge that was passed on? And yeah, go to the elders in your community and just ask them to share some of their knowledge. And you can, in some of your communities, some people accept tobacco, some people, it's different. But that you realize, wow, like the people I spoke with, so many people said to me, "Oh, yeah, my great grandmother was a midwife, or my great auntie was a midwife." Like, that's how close we are to this knowledge. It's so active in our communities, an essential part of our communities. And it's only been, in the past several generations that has been silenced. So it's actually, I'm so thankful when we do ask our elders, our relatives, because it's so important that we do that. Like this is, otherwise that knowledge could be, silenced for,
mhm.
for much longer.
It's yeah, reclaiming what is already within our bloodline. And I love that you came on here and spoke about a bit about your story, the spirit of birth, and it all ties to matriarchy. And I'm curious what the word matriarch means to you.
So, matriarch, I think it means to me like reverence for woman, for the life givers. And when I say life givers, I don't mean like you have to have a child to be a life giver. The matriarch is respect for um, the sacredness of the life givers. Our bodies are sacred, and our connection to creation, is sacred. And so that's what it means to me. And just on and one other note, like everything I think with an indigenous way of viewing is sacred. And
Mhm.
looking at one thing I learned that was so profound in our community, and um others share this, was the belief that the man is also considered pregnant.
Mm.
And so in the way that he's considered pregnant is that that spirit, not only follows the mother, but it's also with the dad. And so the dad has responsibilities to care for
Mhm.
that spirit, you know? And there's certain things that the dad can't do, like during the pregnancy,
Mm.
like different restrictions. And so
Mhm.
one of them was they weren't supposed to hunt or fish.
Mhm.
They weren't supposed to take life during pregnancy because in that time you're supposed to respect life. And
Right.
so there was a certain restriction, but because of that, the community provided so much for that
Mhm.
family. They
Mhm.
protected and they provided, the food, you know, that they needed, because of course they did not want that family to be stressed out about anything, because their job is to have that mom be completely not stressed,
Mhm.
because she's carrying that life inside her. And so I just thought that was such a beautiful teaching,
Mhm.
because then again, like in the mainstream, oh, nothing happens for the man, nothing
Yeah.
changes. But that's so not true, like everything changes for the fathers as well. And so that was so beautiful.
That's
And
beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I was gonna ask you actually, like, what the men's role is within, traditional indigenous birthing methods, but then I knew that was gonna be a big question.
so much, like, because when people gave birth on the land, people could give birth anywhere. And so many men had so much birth knowledge, like how to assist
Mhm.
in birth, and so yeah, it was huge. The men's role, is
Mhm. That's awesome. Yeah, no, I love the reclamation of both, the man and the woman coming together. Where can people watch Spirit of Birth?
so it's available on APTN, which is the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and on their digital platform, it's called Lumi. So you can go to APTN, to their website. I would highly recommend, APTN. I was on their platform before. It's so good. You can get
Mhm.
any documentary or like, series. There's from comedy, to culture, lifestyle. And then, of course, these amazing documentaries. And it's so worth it.
There's a lot of good stuff on APTN. We'll make sure to put that link in the show notes. The Spirit of Birth is also translated in Cree, which is really cool, and in English. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for being here. I honestly learned so much. I'm going to feel more confident, and now I know who to call when I'm eventually going to give birth myself.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me, Miigwech.
Hi, hi. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can follow Rebeka. I'll put everything in the show notes and make sure you tune in and watch Spirit of Birth on APTN Lumi. Hi, hi.